Today on KCCI 8 News Close Up, the hot button issue of immigration, and right here in Iowa, where Iowa's congressional candidates stand and the facts behind some of their claims.
This is Iowa's news leader. This is KCCI 8 News Close Up.
Good morning and welcome to KCCI 8 News Close Up. I'm Chief Political Reporter Amanda Rooker. In Commitment 2024, we are asking all of the Iowans running for Congress about where they stand on key issues, and that, of course, includes immigration. That has been a central talking point on the campaign trail, in stump speeches, at town halls, and it's likely to play a major role in not only the presidential election, but also congressional races right here in our state. The latest Pew Research study on how Americans view the situation at the U.S. southern border shows people overwhelmingly fault the government for how it's handled the migrant situation. 80% say the government is doing a very bad or somewhat bad job of dealing with the large number of migrants trying to cross the southern border. About 9 in 10 Republicans say the government is doing a bad job. Nearly 3/4 of Democrats agree. The Pew study also found 78% of Americans say the number of migrants currently trying to come across the southern border is a crisis. Now looking at Iowa's first congressional district that includes most of northeast Iowa. In that district, Republican incumbent Mariannette Miller Meeks faces Republican primary challenger David Pouch. Democrat Christina Bohannon is also running for that seat, and here's how all three say they would address immigration.
What we saw with this the border bill is that Miller Meeks and her party bosses, they didn't want to solve the problem. They didn't sign on to the most secure, the strictest border security bill that we have ever seen. The bill that the Border Patrol agents said they needed to do their jobs. They thought politicians knew best. They didn't listen to the Border Patrol agents on that. It would force President Biden to actually shut down the border if there were too many people coming. And our own Senator Joni Ernst said it would be the best opportunity that we would have in our lifetimes to secure the border. I would have signed on to that bipartisan border bill. I would have signed on to it. I would have pushed my party leadership to bring it up for a vote. We need to give people a path to citizenship. We need to have that conversation about what is the right amount of immigration and how can we cut the red tape. Because I'll tell you, I've been going all around the district and there are a lot of businesses who need help with doing a lot of the getting rid of a lot of the bureaucracy that's associated with getting their workers visas and things like that. People in Iowa are not opposed to lawful immigration.
What have we done in Congress? We have passed H.R. 2, our border security bill, which has both asylum changes in it. It had the Remain in Mexico policy that people by our Constitution can seek asylum in this country. There are specific reasons to seek asylum. And when you speak with the Border Patrol agents, they'll tell you that when individuals, only 10% of people will come back for their asylum hearings. And of those, only 10% will actually meet the definition of asylum. Most people are coming here for economic reasons. So reforming our legal immigration systems, reforming the asylum laws, those are critically important that we do. And then having some pushback on the cartels, which are now really controlling our southern border, I think is extraordinarily problematic. We know the administration is busing immigrants and putting them on planes and bringing them here. And I think it's horrible to think that under the Trump administration, you had members of Congress that are currently in the minority in the House that were decrying the separation of parents and their children. But now we have over 85,000 children our State Department, our Homeland Security has lost. And what's happened to those children. So it's tragic what is happening.
Now, the problem is caused intentionally by this current administration, this fake president, a treasonous president who is intentionally opening up the borders. This didn't just happen to us. This is an intentional thing. They have planned the invasion. They're actually flying people in here. There's money in the last $1.2 trillion budget to fly people in, some of these invaders in. So it's just absolutely unthinkable that this is going on at the request and the initiative of this phony president. So that has to be done. And Congress does have some leverage, but it takes some guts to use the leverage that they do have. It's beyond impeachment. It's time for arrests. And there's just a lot of things, very practical things that can be done to solve this thing. But unless you have a border, you don't have a country. And they've inundated us with over 7 million invaders. And I'm sure some of them are very good people, but we also know that there's a bunch of terrorists in the mix, potential terrorist sleeper cells just waiting for the orders. People coming in from China. They didn't cross over because they lived in Mexico. They've come in, they've been planted from all over the place. So it's just an absolutely critical situation.
And there is some more context to some of those claims made by the candidates, starting with David Pauch, who you just saw there. An Associated Press fact check found that there is not money in the federal budget to fly migrants into the country. Under a law passed in the 1950s, Biden has exercised what's called parole authority to admit refugees, quote, only on a case-by-case basis for urgent humanitarian reasons or significant public benefit. Biden's program allows only Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans who have been vetted and screened to stay in the U.S. for 2 years with a temporary work permit. Any migrant granted entry under that program is responsible for their own cost of travel to the United States. They must also have a valid passport from their country of origin and a sponsor who can financially support them. We also wanted to look at Pauch's claim that terrorists are coming into the country illegally over the border. Now, according to the data that we do have on the number of people coming across the southern border from the U.S., that's from Customs and Border Protection data, Border Patrol agents at the southern border stopped 92 people on the terrorist watch list between last October and the end of April. For context, that is less than 0.1% of all encounters with immigrants at the southern border during the same amount of time. Now looking to Marionette Miller Meeks, she mentioned that the Department of Homeland Security has lost 85,000 kids who have come across the border. Now that number comes from a New York Times investigation that was done in February of 2023. And the Times reported that over the span of 2 years, the Department of Health and Human Services could not reach more than 85,000 children that had come into the country. And that, quote, the agency lost immediate contact with a third of migrant children. Now, a month later, the secretary of that agency told Congress during a House committee hearing that that number was incorrect and misleading. He said even though the government does try to reach out to migrant kids once they've been resettled, quote, neither the child or the sponsor is actually obligated to follow up with us. And there is also context around Christina Bohannon's claim that Miller Meeks did not sign on to a border security bill. What Bohannon is referencing there is an immigration reform package that a group of bipartisan federal lawmakers worked on earlier this year. That bill would have made sweeping changes to border security, like tightening the U.S. asylum process and creating a new system to shut down the border if the number of illegal crossings exceed a certain number. Now, despite initial strong bipartisan support, the Senate voted not to advance that bill back in February. It's not been taken up in the House, so Miller Meeks has not voted on it. Now, in May of last year, Miller Meeks did vote yes on House Resolution 2. That would have required the government to build a wall at the U.S. southern border, require every U.S. employer to verify that all their workers are documented, and would have put major new restrictions on how immigrants can seek asylum. Miller Meeks also voted for a bill to create new penalties for interfering with U.S. border control and another bill to make really wide-ranging border policy changes. Now, David Pauch and Christina Bohannon don't have federal voting records that we can check. When we come back, we look at Iowa's 2nd district, what incumbent Ashley Hinson says she's done on immigration, and why challenger Sarah Corkery says she can do it better. Welcome back to Close Up. We're taking a closer look at how Iowa's congressional candidates would address immigration. In the state's 2nd congressional district, which includes most of southeast Iowa, Republican incumbent Ashley Hinson will face Democrat Sarah Corkery in November. I asked both of them what action they would take on immigration and border security.
Immigration is so important, and we need to remember our country is based off immigration, and that diversity of people and thought bring value to our country. We have a situation at the border. It's overstressed and underfunded. We need to give more resources so that we can get the block that's down there, the backlog of people trying to get in or have their asylum cases heard. We need to make that faster to get out of this. Then we need to give more resources so more judges can be involved, and we can put legal ways for people to join our economy, legal ways for them to become citizens, and legal ways to have jobs that we very much need fulfilled. So we have a crisis at the border. We need some common sense solutions. Just building a wall and just turning people away are not the answer. And I certainly don't believe that we want a representative like Ashley Hinson and our own governor who said ignore the Supreme Court and don't put the razor wires in the water. They said to ignore the Supreme Court and keep the razor wires in the water that are hurting immigrants who are physically trying to enter. We need to remember we are humans first, and we need to take care of humans in that way and find ways for them, as I said, to enter our system legally.
This is President Biden's border crisis, plain and simple. I actually had the chance to question Secretary Mayorkas in our Homeland Security Committee, and I got him to admit for the first time under oath that we do indeed have a crisis at our southern border. So I'm doing a number of things to help push back on these terrible and disastrous Biden policies. Number one, I've called on him to reverse the executive orders that he put in place that have created this crisis. We need Remain in Mexico. We need to build the wall. We need to give our CBP and ICE agents the tools that they need to keep our country safe rather than kneecapping them like this administration has done. So those are the priorities that I'm going to continue to work toward, continue to pressure President Biden. Hopefully we have a new administration who will actually take securing the border seriously. But it is the number one issue that I hear as I travel through all 22 counties. I've done town halls in almost all of them already in this term. And I continue to hear about every state being a border state. I recently did meetings with local law enforcement in the district. They're telling me that the cartel cases in Iowa have tripled since President Biden took office. Tripled. We're not talking about ounce drug deals anymore. We're talking about pounds. And that is affecting the safety and security of our communities every single day. So it's very, very clear what we need to do. Undo all those executive actions that President Biden put into place. I've sent him a letter demanding that with more than 60 of my colleagues. So far, we've heard nothing but lip service from President Biden and from Secretary Mayorkas.
And again, we're looking at how these candidates have voted on immigration bills. So in May of last year, Ashley Hinson also voted yes on House Resolution 2. Again, that would require the government to build a wall at the U.S. southern border, would have required every U.S. employer to verify that all their workers are documented, and would have put major new restrictions on how immigrants can seek asylum. Hinson has also voted for a bill to create new penalties for interfering with U.S. border control. She also co-sponsored the Laken-Riley Act. That would require the Secretary of Homeland Security to take into custody immigrants who've been charged with theft. Democrat Sarah Corkery has not held public office, so she doesn't have a voter record that we can check. Coming up after the break, we look at Iowa's 3rd congressional district and how the issue of immigration could impact one of the most competitive races in the country. Welcome back to Close Up. We are asking all of Iowa's congressional candidates how they would address border policy. In Iowa's 3rd congressional district, which includes most of southwest Iowa, Democrats Lenon Bacom and Melissa Vine are facing off in June. Whoever wins will take on Republican incumbent Zach Nunn in November. That will likely be one of the most competitive races in the country. Here's how all 3 candidates say they would handle immigration.
This is an incredibly important issue. This is a national security, economic security issue. We must secure the border. We should know who's coming in and out of this country. And it's really unfortunate that Zach Nunn and Republicans have stood by to let a bipartisan piece of legislation die when there was an opportunity, when the Border Patrol supported this legislation. The fact that we could have had more Border Patrol agents in the ranks. We could have deployed technology to identify fentanyl and drugs going through our ports. Like, these are things that we need to have. And yet, politics gets in the way of progress yet again with Zach Nunn and the Republicans. We have to find a way to get things done, and I will be that person in Congress.
We have seen a massive surge in illegal immigration to the tune of 8 million individuals. That's not only a direct threat to our economy, it's unfair to those individuals who are trying to come here the right way, but are finding themselves usurped. As I saw on the border, the cartel has a better idea of who's coming into this country and what gets into this country than our own administration. It is frightening. Fentanyl made in China, shipped through Mexico, kills more people in this country, my daughter's aged and nearly my age, than anything else. There are good people who want to be able to have the opportunity to serve and come to our country legally, but they're being eclipsed by folks, particularly by the cartel, that allows a person from China to come to the United States and charges them $40,000 just for the transit. We have to stop this. Not only am I committed to it, it's one of the driving forces of things that I want to address going forward.
Immigration is something that comes up a lot when I'm talking to folks about politics, and I think it's really important that we give it the attention that it deserves. There was a fantastic bipartisan bill that went through the Senate, and it included ways to filter who is coming across the border. Are they new Americans that are looking to fill some of those workforce gaps that we have, and we can make these perfect matches, but also to filter out folks that are here for unethical reasons. And so this bill provided for an increase in funding to speed up that process and to provide appropriate checks in those places at the border.
And again, with that bipartisan border bill, it has not been taken up in the House, so Nunn has not voted on it. But looking at how all the candidates have voted on other immigration bills, Zach Nunn is the only one with a voter record we can check. And in May of last year, he voted yes on House Resolution 2 that would reinstate construction of a wall between the U.S. and Mexico, make sure no undocumented immigrants are working for U.S. companies, and would put major new limits on how refugees can seek asylum in the U.S. Nunn has also voted for a bill to create new penalties for interfering with U.S. border control. He also co-sponsored the Laken Riley Act that would require the Secretary of Homeland Security to take into custody immigrants who have been charged with theft. Well, next we look at District 4. Stay with us. We're back in just 2 minutes. In Iowa's 4th congressional district, Republican incumbent Randy Feenstra is facing Republican primary challenger Kevin Virgil. Democrat Ryan Melton is also running for that seat. We asked all three what action they would take to address immigration and border security.
This is the number one issue. This is the number one thing I hear about from my constituents when I travel through my 36 counties. Is we've got to stop and build the wall. I mean, we've got to stop illegals from coming in. I hear this from our sheriff's offices that says that drugs are rampant, whether it be meth or fentanyl. This has got to stop. I hear from hospitals that are getting burdened by illegals coming through. I hear from the education and schools. I mean, this is catastrophic, not only to Iowa, but to our whole nation. So number one, we've got to stop catch and release. That can't happen. We've got to keep remaining in Mexico. We have to make sure we build the wall. We have to make sure that we're paying our patrol agents. These are all things that we passed in the U.S. House, but the U.S. Senate refuses to take them up. So we have to make sure Biden takes some of these things up, and he refuses to do any of them at this point in time. We've got to stop the illegals coming across our border. You think about what could happen. I mean, you think about what happened in 9/11. That could easily happen again. We do not know who's coming in and out of our borders. And we could have our own big terrorist problem if we don't shut down the borders.
First thing that I would really be an advocate for is a robust immigrant labor program that would align migration flows with labor shortages throughout the country. So for example, you have a governor like Greg Abbott in Texas or Ron DeSantis in Florida, and what they're doing is they're just taking migrants, they're putting them on a bus, and they're dropping them on some random doorstep. We need to have a federal-state coordination program where if a southern governor feels overwhelmed by migration flows, they can reach out to a federal entity that says, this is the part of the country we need more labor help with. Certainly in Northwest Iowa, we need a lot of labor help. We really need a lot more immigration judges, a lot more asylum judges. We need to do a lot more partnering with countries in Central and South America to see what we can do to incentivize their absorption and assimilation of migrants that are coming north. Study after study shows that both documented and undocumented immigrants commit crime at much lower rates than native-born citizens. The data is clear on that. And so the last thing I want to do is to scapegoat and fearmonger.
I would stand with those conservative Republicans and would certainly vote to shut down the government until an administration that's complicit in this this immigration disaster we're facing took steps to resolve it. The second thing I think we have to deal with some strategic or some structural problems that we face as a nation right now. I think eliminating citizenship by birthright is a great first step. I think we need to defund or remove any federal funding for NGOs and so-called charitable organizations that are aiding and abetting the onslaught of illegal immigrants that are coming into this country. We need to establish harsher penalties for private sector employers that knowingly employ illegal immigrants. We just need to look. I think we also need a complete overhaul of the immigration systems that we bring in more of the immigrants that we need legally, which is what most countries interested in their long-term survival do, right? We want to bring in the world's best and brightest, as we always have, through a lawful process and an efficient process to make sure we're bringing in the right kind of immigrants.
In May of last year, Randy Feenstra joined Iowa's 3 other Republican representatives and voted yes on House Resolution 2. That again would require the government to build a wall at the U.S. southern border, would implement a system to verify that every U.S. worker is documented, and would put major new limits on who can seek asylum and how those refugees enter the country. Feenstra also approved a bill to create new penalties for interfering with U.S. border control. And along with Hinson and Nunn, he co-sponsored the Laken Riley Act, so any immigrants charged with theft in the U.S. would be taken into custody. Ryan Melton and Kevin Virgil have not held public office, so neither of them have voter records we can check. And of course, immigration has also been a hot topic in our state recently, with Iowa lawmakers pushing several pieces of immigration reform during the last legislative session. Right now, the federal government is suing Iowa over its latest immigration law. That law gives state judges the authority to arrest and deport some undocumented immigrants who've previously been denied entry into the U.S. The lawsuit was filed about a week ago in an effort to block the legislation from taking effect on July 1st. In a statement, the Justice Department wrote, quote, Iowa cannot disregard the U.S. Constitution and settled Supreme Court precedent, arguing only the federal government has authority over enforcing immigration rules. Also last week, civil rights groups filed a separate lawsuit to try and block the law. It was filed on behalf of the Iowa Migrant Movement for Justice and 2 Iowa clients. Immigration advocates with the ACLU of Iowa say the law is dangerous and increases fear. Des Moines police chief told us immigration status does not factor into their work to keep the community safe. We did ask for a response from Governor Kim Reynolds. She doubled down on her stance. Reynolds says she has a responsibility to protect Iowans and that, quote, since President Biden refuses to enforce our nation's immigration laws, threatening the safety of our citizens, Iowa will step in. Iowa's law does closely mirror a Texas law that is currently on hold while a federal appeals court reviews it. Well, thanks for joining us for KCCI 8 News Close Up. We'll see you back here next Sunday. Have a great day.